When people talk about Brian Dixon's greatest achievement, some will say challenging joint promotions, others will say getting All-Star Wrestling onto ITV, some will point to the incredible longevity of his promotion, but I think his greatest achievement came after all of those things, because after television disappeared, Brian somehow managed to make British wrestling part of family holidays. Hello everyone, I'm Josh Faulkner, the wrestling comedian. Before we get into it, hit like and drop me a follow. This is the incredible story of Brian Dixon Part 3. For decades, if your family went to Butlins, there's a good chance you saw All-Star Wrestling. Night after night, holiday camp after holiday camp, Brian Dixon brought live professional wrestling to families who may never have stepped inside a town hall or a leisure centre to watch it otherwise. For many children, it wasn't just their first wrestling show, it was their first live sporting event, their first heroes, their first villains, their first time shouting at a wrestler, the first autograph, the first programme, and for many, it became the highlight of their holiday. Brian understood something that many promoters never truly appreciated. Children didn't care whether wrestling was fashionable, they cared whether it was exciting. If they left smiling, they'd remember it forever. That's exactly what happened. Thousands upon thousands of families grew up with Brian Dixon's wrestling. Some became lifelong fans, some became wrestlers, some became promoters, some became referees, others simply carried those memories into adulthood. The influence of those Butlin shows is impossible to measure because it isn't measured in ticket sales. It's measured in memories. I was one of those children. Some of my happiest childhood memories involved Brian Dixon shows. Every year we'd go on family holidays to Butlins in Bognor Regis and I'd count down the days until wrestling night. Even my nan remembers Brian, not as the legendary promoter, not as the man who challenged joint promotions, not as the man who kept British wrestling alive when ITV pulled the plug. She remembers him as the old boy selling the foam hands in the programs. I've always loved that because it perfectly sums Brian up. He was arguably the biggest promoter in British wrestling, and he'd still be standing there himself, selling programs, selling foam hands. There was no ego, no sense that certain jobs were beneath him. Brian understood something very simple. Every single person through those doors mattered. But it wasn't just Butlins where I got my wrestling fix. My granddad used to take me to Brian's town shows as well. High Wycombe Town Hall, the Beck Theatre in Hayes, sitting there as a kid, watching wrestlers I'd only ever dreamed of seeing in person. The atmosphere, the music, the anticipation before the first bell, I absolutely loved it. If there was one thing every wrestler who worked for Brian says, it's this: nobody worked harder. People often see the promoter standing at the entrance on show day or announcing something before the show. What they don't see is everything that comes before that. Brian would spend all day around the wrestling show, travelling to it, ensuring it ran smoothly, then driving hundreds of miles home, sometimes arriving in the early hours of the morning, 2, 3, sometimes even 4 a.m. Most people would take the next day off. Not Brian. At 9 o'clock sharp, like clockwork, he'd be at his office, 81 Fountain Street, and that address became legendary in British wrestling. For decades, it was the nerve centre of All-Star Wrestling. Every booking, every phone call, every poster, every programme, every contract, every invoice, every problem, it all seemed to pass through Brian's desk. If you phoned the office, there was a very good chance you spoke to Brian himself. The work never stopped. Brian simply got on with it, week after week, month after month, year after year, for more than 50 years. I honestly don't know how he did it, especially when coordinating multiple shows a day. In his later years, when supplying both Butlins and Haven with wrestling, there could be up to 10 plus shows a day in peak summer seasons, but it still all came together. The wrestlers got to the shows, and so did a fresh batch of foam hands. If you worked for Brian, sooner or later you found yourself at 81 Fountain Street. There was something almost magical about that office. That was really no more than Brian's childhood bedroom in the family home in Birkenhead. There was posters everywhere, photographs, boxes of programs, schedules, paperwork, telephones constantly ringing. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't some corporate headquarters, it was simply the beating heart of British wrestling. Everything flowed through there. 81 Fountain Street also served as the digs where travelling wrestlers would call it home for their spells here. One thing people outside British wrestling sometimes overlook is just how many future stars passed through All-Star Wrestling. Brian had built something incredibly valuable, not just another wrestling promotion, but a place where wrestlers could learn their craft in front of real crowds. Night after night, town after town, holiday camp after holiday camp. If you wanted to improve, there was no substitute for wrestling every day. Word spread pretty quickly. Long before WWE and AEW signed many wrestlers, they came to work for Brian. Sheamus, Drew McIntyre, Wade Barrett, Bryan Danielson, Nigel McGuinness, Chris Hero, Colt Cabana, Sami Zayn, Andre Chase, Cash Wheeler, and countless others. They all benefited from the opportunities Brian created. That's one of his greatest legacies. He wasn't just producing wrestling shows, he was also producing wrestlers. Brian didn't just help create future stars, he also gave British fans the chance to meet legends they'd only ever seen on television, and also incredible international wrestlers that made their careers outside the bright lights of WWE. As the years went on, All-Star Wrestling became home to an incredible list of former WWE, WCW, and international names. Gangrel, Finlay, Brody Steele, Chad Collier, Joe Legend, the Honky Tonk Man, Earthquake, the Bushwhackers, PN News, Marty Jannetty, Tatanka, and so many others. Some came for special tours, some wrestled repeatedly, some shared dressing rooms with young British wrestlers who'd grown up watching them on television. That was another of Brian's strengths. He understood nostalgia. Families who remembered watching WWF in the 1980s and 90s suddenly had the chance to see those same stars live, often just a few miles from home. At the same time, those international names were sharing the ring with Britain's next generation. Brian had created something unique. His shows celebrated wrestling's past whilst quietly building its future.